As you know, on this program, we explore mysteries that, rightly or wrongly, are characterized as paranormal, something outside the parameters of science, too wacky to be taken seriously by some, so foreign to our everyday experiences in life that they often take a back seat to more mundane but more pressing matters, such as just going to work, paying the bills, mowing the lawn. Tonight, we'll try to tackle the biggest questions of all, namely, what is our place in the universe? Where do we fit in the cosmic order? You know, what's the seating chart, the pecking order? If there are other unseen intelligences interacting with us, what's their intent and why us? Why do they have such an intense, long-standing interest in our little lives? I often hear people say they're ready for the truth. Let me have it. Give me the goods. They want disclosure. They want someone to peel back the curtain and tell them what's really going on. And my reply sometimes is, are you sure? You're ready for what to be disclosed exactly? Because maybe there are parts of these mysteries that would be so disturbing that they would basically change everything and might not be so easy for us to absorb, let alone to accept. You know, it's one thing to go out and search the skies for UFOs, do a little UFO outing, looking for thrilling but seemingly harmless bright lights flitting around in the sky. Sometimes you'll see be a witness to, like what looks like a distinct craft. And every once in a while, eyewitnesses will see glimpses of what they think of as alien beings. But amorphous, fleeting images in the sky that seem to mean us no harm, it's quite another thing altogether to come face to face with the unknown, to have it inside your home, in your room, in your face, maybe even inside your body in ways that are incredibly invasive, even violent. It's described as something akin to rape by some of those to whom it's happened. People who've had the so-called abduction experience often report symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, as defined by soldiers returning from battle. In a nutshell, these folks are genuinely messed up. Something did it to them, but what was it? It's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our pursuit of the unknown, our search for the truth, because this is so personal for those involved and so hard for the rest of us to believe. Tonight, we explore what might be the most intense, most troubling abduction case of all, one that involved not just one or two bewildered individuals, but a large number of people, all seemingly plucked from the same place, which turns out to be a UFO conference in a historic building, a location that was at the same time where a former president and his Secret Service delegation were visiting. How these details came spilling out is quite a detective story. This evening we'll hear from three of the people who were there and who have conscious memories of the bizarre events of a prophetic weekend on Coronado Island, just off the Pacific coast near San Diego. And, in my view, this is a gripping tale, as described in a new book by the principal investigator, Yvonne Smith. Yvonne will be my guest coming up in just a couple of minutes. And then in the second half of the program tonight, we'll be joined by two of the people who say they were taken out of their rooms at the Hotel del Coronado. Jesse Long will be making his coast-to-coast debut. He'll tell us about a lifetime of weird encounters, plus what happened to him on the island. And then Melinda Leslie, who is no stranger to this program, was also on the island, says she was not only taken that night, but remembers seeing some of the other abductees while they were in the clutches of these visitors. It's quite a story. Yvonne Smith is no newcomer to the UFO mystery. She started working on it as a researcher in the late 80s, became a certified hypnotherapist in 1990, and has helped hundreds of people dealing with the very real consequences of their encounters with the unknown. She founded something called CERO, C-E-R-O, Close Encounters Resource Organization, and it's not only been a framework for investigating abductions and UFOs, but also support for those to whom this happens. She is a contemporary and colleague of the giants in the field, John Mack, Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and others. And her new book, Coronado, The President, the Secret Service, and Alien Abductions, is just out, and it's a page-turner. Yvonne, good to have you back.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me on.
Before I want to ask some questions in this hour about the abduction scenario in general, the kinds of questions that you get asked and criticisms that you get asked all the time. But first, perhaps you could sort of set the table for us, the date and location of this mass abduction, who was involved, kind of give us the broad strokes, and then we'll get to the specifics later.
Well, this occurred back in March, weekend in March, 26th, 27th, 1994. During that time, the Triad organization was, and I don't know if you remember that organization, George, but it was putting on conferences all over the United States. And this
it was Bob Bigelow, right?
Bob Bigelow sponsored these conferences. And this is where John Mack and myself and Bud and David Jacobs, we'd all travel together. With this particular conference, the organizers asked me to MC the conference since it was practically in my backyard in San Diego on Coronado Island. So I was there. We had, of course, the, speakers wonderful speakers we've had all these years at conferences. We've had, there were so many, I should have had my list in front of me, but Bud was there, Colin Andrews speaking about crop circles, John Carpenter, and it was just an extraordinary conference because it was held at the historic Hotel del Coronado. And during this time, my serial members decided to all caravan down to the island and be together for the conference and meet other experiencers that came in. And it just so happened that one by one they started coming up to me during that weekend, telling me that they weren't feeling well, and one person avoided the conference altogether after paying for it ahead of time to make sure he had a seat, a reservation. He didn't even want to go near the conference. And, I was not putting this together at the time, George, because I was so busy. As you know, when you MC, you have to keep everybody on time and make sure all the speakers are there. And I just, did not put it together, and neither did the experiencers until after the conference when they all got home and a couple of them start talking to each other. I think something happened, but I'm not sure. It's always that, that hazy, you're not sure that something happened, except for the fact that there was physical evidence. There was blood on the pillow, and one person came away with, we'll call it an implant in her leg. So it was... when I started putting all of this together, I realized, oh, my God, this is getting to be bigger than I ever dreamed. And then the fact, as you mentioned in the introduction, that then-President Bill Clinton was there, along with his entourage of Secret Service. And I had the advantage of being there. I didn't just write the story. I had the advantage of being there myself, and I recall several Secret Service agents walking around with their earpieces, they had sunglasses on. I mean, they stuck out like a sore thumb. I mean, they didn't look like any of the other guests in the hotel. And, I walked around with my UFO badge, Yvonne Smith MC, Triad, conference. But, they go months in advance, and they scope out the area where the president's going to be. They knew we were going to be there. But it was just a very strange turn of events. And the more I started writing and putting together the transcripts, and I was still doing hypnotic regressions on the participants as I was writing the book, because it continues. These experiences do not just stop. I mean, they continue throughout the person's life.
This wasn't like everybody came back from the conference, all got in a room and said, hey, did this happen to you? Yeah, it happened to me, and all came bursting out at once where they all realize it. I mean, it's in little tiny bits and pieces,
Exactly.
a lot of it behind closed doors with you, right?
Exactly. And I have the dates down of the regressions after the conference. I believe one was, somewhere a few months after the conference. I think one was a year or so after the conference. It was just getting, there's always hints with people who are having these experiences. It's never they have a totally blank mind. They have these bits and pieces of something strange happened. They know very well that in these experiences, many times the person's awake or they're driving, but they know something strange happened. They just can't place it. So it just so happened that little by little the story started forming, and then there were, in the very beginning, I think there were about 6 people who started coming to me, and they were suspecting that something may have happened. And then as I was putting all this together, then I had about 3 other people thinking that something may have happened to them. So I wound up with about a dozen people right now, at least, that had experiences that weekend on Coronado Island, and I suspect, George, that I may be contacted by other people who were there who didn't even realize what was happening after they read the book.
When you think about it, I mean, I can hear some wisecracker go, well, look, a UFO conference, how convenient for aliens. They could grab them all at once. They don't have to go around the country and pick them up at home. It's amazing it doesn't happen more often.
Well, it does happen, George. It really does happen. I have hosted the experiencer sessions at the UFO Congress a few times. And this last one, there's a need for support in this. I had probably 60 people in this experience.
As you know, on this program, we explore mysteries that, rightly or wrongly, are characterized as paranormal, something outside the parameters of science, too wacky to be taken seriously by some, so foreign to our everyday experiences in life that they often take a back seat to more mundane but more pressing matters, such as just going to work, paying the bills, mowing the lawn. Tonight, we'll try to tackle the biggest questions of all, namely, what is our place in the universe? Where do we fit in the cosmic order? What's the seating chart, the pecking order? If there are other unseen intelligences interacting with us, what's their intent, and why us? Why do they have such an intense, long-standing interest in our little lives? I often hear people say they're ready for the truth. Let me have it. Give me the goods. They want disclosure. They want someone to peel back the curtain and tell them what's really going on. And my reply sometimes is, are you sure? You're ready for what to be disclosed exactly? Because maybe there are parts of these mysteries that would be so disturbing that they would basically change everything and might not be so easy for us to absorb, let alone to accept. It's one thing to go out and search the skies for UFOs, do a little UFO outing, looking for thrilling but seemingly harmless bright lights flitting around in the sky. Sometimes you'll see be a witness to, like what looks like a distinct craft. And every once in a while, eyewitnesses will see glimpses of what they think of as alien beings. But amorphous, fleeting images in the sky that seem to mean us no harm, it's quite another thing altogether to come face to face with the unknown, to have it inside your home, in your room, in your face, maybe even inside your body in ways that are incredibly invasive, even violent. It's described as something akin to rape by some of those to whom it's happened. People who've had the so-called abduction experience often report symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder, as defined by soldiers returning from battle. In a nutshell, these folks are genuinely messed up. Something did it to them, but what was it? It's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our pursuit of the unknown, our search for the truth, because this is so personal for those involved and so hard for the rest of us to believe. Tonight, we explore what might be the most intense, most troubling abduction case of all, one that involved not just one or two bewildered individuals, but a large number of people, all seemingly plucked from the same place, which turns out to be a UFO conference in a historic building, a location that was at the same time where a former president and his Secret Service delegation were visiting. How these details came spilling out is quite a detective story. This evening we'll hear from three of the people who were there and who have conscious memories of the bizarre events of a prophetic weekend on Coronado Island, just off the Pacific coast near San Diego. And, in my view, this is a gripping tale, as described in a new book by the principal investigator, Yvonne Smith. Yvonne will be my guest coming up in just a couple of minutes. And then in the second half of the program tonight, we'll be joined by two of the people who say they were taken out of their rooms at the Hotel del Coronado. Jesse Long will be making his coast-to-coast debut. He'll tell us about a lifetime of weird encounters, plus what happened to him on the island. And then Melinda Leslie, who is no stranger to this program, was also on the island, says she was not only taken that night, but remembers seeing some of the other abductees while they were in the clutches of these visitors. It's quite a story. Yvonne Smith is no newcomer to the UFO mystery. She started working on it as a researcher in the late 80s, became a certified hypnotherapist in 1990, and has helped hundreds of people dealing with the very real consequences of their encounters with the unknown. She founded something called CERO, C-E-R-O, Close Encounters Resource Organization, and it's not only been a framework for investigating abductions and UFOs, but also support for those to whom this happens. She is a contemporary and colleague of the giants in the field, John Mack, Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and others. And her new book, Coronado, The President, the Secret Service, and Alien Abductions, is just out, and it's a page-turner. Yvonne, good to have you back.
Thank you, George. It's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for having me on.
Before I want to ask some questions in this hour about the abduction scenario in general, the kinds of questions that you get asked and criticisms that you get asked all the time. But first, perhaps you could sort of set the table for us, the date and location of this mass abduction, who was involved, kind of give us the broad strokes, and then we'll get to the specifics later.
Well, this occurred back in March, a weekend in March, 26th, 27th, 1994. During that time, the Triad organization was, and I don't know if you remember that organization, George, but it was putting on conferences all over the United States. And
it was Bob Bigelow, right?
Bob Bigelow sponsored these conferences. And this is where John Mack and myself and Bud and David Jacobs, we'd all travel together. With this particular conference, the organizers asked me to MC the conference, since it was practically in my backyard in San Diego on Coronado Island. So I was there. We have, of course, the speakers, wonderful speakers we've had all these years at conferences. We've had, there were so many, I should have had my list in front of me, but Bud was there, Colin Andrews speaking about crop circles, John Carpenter, and it was just an extraordinary conference because it was held at the historic Hotel del Coronado. And during this time, my CERO members decided to all caravan down to the island and be together for the conference and meet other experiencers that came in. And it just so happened that one by one they started coming up to me during that weekend, telling me that they weren't feeling well, and one person avoided the conference altogether after paying for it ahead of time to make sure he had a seat, a reservation. He didn't even want to go near the conference. And, I was not putting this together at the time, George, because I was so busy. As you know, when you MC, you have to keep everybody on time and make sure all the speakers are there. And I just did not put it together, and neither did the experiencers until after the conference, when they all got home and a couple of them start talking to each other. I think something happened, but I'm not sure. It's always that that hazy. You're not sure that something happened, except for the fact that there was physical evidence. There was blood on the pillow, and one person came away with, we'll call it an implant in her leg. So it was, when I started putting all of this together, I realized, oh my God, this is getting to be bigger than I ever dreamed. And then the fact, as you mentioned in the introduction, that then President Bill Clinton was there, along with his entourage of Secret Service. And I had the advantage of being there. I didn't just write the story. I had the advantage of being there myself. And I recall several Secret Service agents walking around with their earpieces, they had sunglasses on. I mean, they stuck out like a sore thumb. I mean, they didn't look like any of the other guests in the hotel. And, I walked around with my UFO badge, Yvonne Smith MC, Triad, conference. But, they go months in advance, and they scope out the area where the president's going to be. They knew we were going to be there. But it was just a very strange turn of events. And the more I started writing and putting together the transcripts, and I was still doing hypnotic regressions on the participants as I was writing the book, because it continues. These experiences do not just stop. I mean, they continue throughout the person's life.
This wasn't like everybody came back from the conference, all got in a room and said, hey, did this happen to you? Yeah, it happened to me, and all came bursting out at once where they all realize it. I mean, it's in little tiny bits and pieces, exactly. A lot of it behind closed doors with you, right?
Exactly. And I have the dates down of the regressions after the conference. I believe one was, somewhere a few months after the conference. I think one was a year or so after the conference. It was just getting, there's always hints with people who are having these experiences. It's never they have a totally blank mind. They have these bits and pieces of something strange happened. They know very well that in these experiences, many times the person's awake or they're driving, but they know something strange happened. They just can't place it. So it just so happened that little by little the story started forming, and then there were, in the very beginning, I think there were around about 6 people who started coming to me, and they were suspecting that something may have happened. And then as I was putting all this together, then I had about 3 other people thinking that something may have happened to them. So I wound up with about a dozen people right now, at least, that had experiences that weekend on Coronado Island. And I suspect, George, that I may be contacted by other people who were there who didn't even realize what was happening after they read the book.
When you think about it, I mean, I can hear some wisecracker go, well, look, a UFO conference, how convenient for aliens. They could grab them all at once. They don't have to go around the country and pick them up at home. It's amazing it doesn't happen more often.
Well, it does happen, George. It really does happen. I have hosted the experiencer sessions at the UFO Congress a few times. And this last one, there's a need for support in this. I had probably 60 people in this experiencer session just wanting to share their story and listening to other people. And towards the end of the week, I asked these people in the room? I mean, it was standing room only. How many people, while you've been here at the Congress, feel that something's happened to you? And I think 3/4 of the room raised their hand.
How much of that, Yvonne, how much of that is wishful thinking? People who, if you're a member of CERO, your organization, you have an interest in UFOs. Man, I want to see an alien. I mean, that's you must get hit with that question a lot. Is it wishful thinking that people want to be abducted, so it happens, at least in their minds?
We've discussed this in the meetings, and people have come up to me and said, I think that would be great. I would really wish they'd come and get me. Huh. And I say to them, you know what? You better be careful what you wish for, because they really don't know how involved this is and how it affects someone's life. I also had a long-term client who finally told them, sometimes they do talk to them and thinking that, okay, maybe I'll get an answer. But she said, I think I really am ready for a totally conscious experience. So she said, okay, I'm ready. You guys want to come and take my DNA, whatever you do, that's fine, but I want to know what you're doing, and I want to be awake. And she came to me months later, and she was very traumatized because she said, I was awake, and I saw them coming in, and she absolutely fell apart. And here, she's been a lifelong abductee since childhood. So it's a matter of, it's not something that's fun, where people will say, oh, I wish that would happen to me, and ha-ha, and, I won't come back. And, it really is a serious subject, and something that's why I keep talking about it all these years, because it really needs to be taken out of the closet completely. People need to be able to talk about this freely and without the fear of losing their standing in the community or losing their jobs. We're in 2014, and, unfortunately, we're still talking about this taboo about people being contacted and taken by UFO occupants. But then, unfortunately, we're still talking about, black and white in our society in 2014, when we should all be together. Look at how our society, George, how sometimes people will treat other people differently because they are different. How would they react to aliens coming down and really showing themselves? I've
interviewed a couple of dozen abductees over the years, not a fraction of how many you've counseled and spoken to. But I think there's only one of all those that I've talked to who seemed to want this to happen and was happy about it. I don't think it really happened to her. She's describing a variety of different aliens and how pleasant it was, and got more grandiose with each explanation. And I think she really was talking herself into it, as opposed to somebody to whom it had happened, because the people who have had a genuine experience, whatever it is, are messed up. I mean, there are consequences to this. There are mental consequences and emotional consequences, physical sometimes, and they're not happy. It screws up their lives. They don't know how to deal with it, and it's certainly not something they want to boast about or talk about.
Well, that's the problem, is they should be able to talk about this. This should be on CNN, in the 6 o'clock news. We shouldn't have to talk about this behind closed doors anymore. And this is why 22 years ago I founded CERO, the support group, because I realized once someone left my office, there was no one for them to talk to, not even a spouse or a family member, and they felt very isolated. And when I started my practice and CERO, the support group, back then in the early 90s, we didn't have the Internet. We didn't have email. We were just starting to use email. Our phone bills were tremendous. Those of us, researchers, we pay out of pocket.
Yvonne, a couple of more general questions about the abduction scenario to deal with, and then we'll get to specifics from your book. You must hear it a lot about alternative explanations. People will say, well, these people who report this are mentally disturbed or mentally ill. They're schizophrenic. They dreamed this stuff. They imagined it. It was sleep paralysis. There's a whole range of explanations for this case or that case. As David Jacob once told me in an interview, he said, look, whatever explanation, it's got to explain all of it. It's got to deal with multiple witness cases. It's got to deal with independent witness cases, physical damage, and the fact, he says, that a lot of these memories are not from hypnosis. It's not induced. It's people who are conscious. So address for me the general response you give to that panoply of explanations that people try to use to dismiss this phenomena.
Oh, yes, George. Everything that you had mentioned, I mean, I've been doing this now for 23 years, and I've heard just about, every explanation that it could possibly be, but it could not be alien abduction. I tell them, okay, sleep paralysis, these people are not always sleeping. They're driving, they're awake, they're, with other people. There are many, many cases. Of course, the first one was at 61 with the Betty and Barney Hill case. They were driving. In my first book, Chosen, I had a case of two women who experienced missing time, and they were driving on a busy highway. So, those explanations anymore, really, they don't cover this entire phenomenon. And this is why, I decided, it took me a long time to put together all the information for Coronado because there were so many people involved, but because there were so many people involved, and this happened, right under the nose of, the elite Secret Service, I felt that, this story has to be told because I hear people, I say on the television or somebody being interviewed about the alien abductions, the skeptics, and they say, why is it always someone by themselves in the middle of a cornfield? Well, obviously these people don't know, the details about these cases, and the people who come forward bravely enough to want to find out what happened to them. I've dealt with people that are professional people, people small walks of life, professional airline pilots and, doctors and, therapists. I mean, so all these alternative explanations are things that I've heard, as you have over the years. It just does not fly. It just does not hold water anymore. And, I had to battle over the years many skeptics and debunkers, and I don't do it anymore, George. I don't have time to sit there and battle with somebody who's completely closed-minded, who won't even look at the cases and study them in detail.
No matter what evidence you had. Yeah, exactly. No matter what evidence.
They have their minds made up. I love when Stan Friedman, he and I've lectured many times together, and he said, they say, don't bother me with the facts, my mind is made up. And that's exactly what happens. And it just, you don't have time anymore to deal with that. I mean, we're far beyond that, George. We have to, we have to come forward with all of these cases, and there's so many brave people now coming forward, because of Coronado. I'm working on a show pretty soon that's going to be airing, I hope, with with all the lucky stars it will, and also working on a documentary about Coronado. And there are people that are willing to come forward and willing to use their real names because they feel that they need to be real about this. If they're to be believed, they have to be real about this when they share their story.
Always struck me as one important distinction is that the people involved, in my estimation, don't want it to be real. They look for any explanation, but don't tell me I was taken by aliens and
Absolutely.
Samples were. They don't want it to be true.
Well, in fact, I got an email today from a client who is having a very hard time dealing with the reality of this. And, they'll come to me and they'll say, all these years, I still hear it, please tell me I'm crazy so I can be put in the hospital or given medication. And obviously, these people are not crazy. I mean, I get referrals from psychiatrists, other traditional therapists, because they don't really know what to do with this. It's, everything is people want to put it in a nice, neat little box and tie it with a bow. And this is, you can't put this phenomenon in a little box. It's not, it's not in the manuals, the DSM manuals. It's not. I didn't learn to do this when I went to hypnotherapy college. I learned the basics. I learned the tools. I trained with Bud Hopkins, and at some point, this is going to be my next goal, George, is to travel the country and teach other therapists how to do this work, because we don't have enough people doing this and taking this seriously. And there are many people. I mean, I get emails from all over the world. I just came back from Brazil. All the stories are the same, no matter where you go. So there's a great need for help, support groups, just support systems. And I want to try to do my part in trying to train other people to do this.
Let's talk about memory. Of course, that plays such a big part in all of this, in the stories that are told in your book, Coronado. What people can remember, the idea of screen memories. Now, the critics would scoff at that. It's ridiculous. What are you telling me, that you remember seeing a big-eyed owl or a deer? There's a screen memory in there. You can't remember this. Your memory is blocked. That's ridiculous. And yet, this article I just posted that I think you had a chance to read says that scientists are on the verge of being able to do this at will, to inject a memory, to erase a memory, to do the kinds of things that these visitors, wherever they're from, have been able to demonstrate for a long time.
Exactly. I mean, if these scientists are doing this now, and this article's come out, this month, you can imagine how long these alien beings have been doing this. I mean, I've been doing this for 23 years. I mean, Bud and David Jacobs, they're both doing it. Bud was doing it, over 40 years, 45 years, or whatever it was. And we were coming out with the same details of how they can put whatever they want in your mind to make you feel that you're seeing, say, a dead family member, rather than seeing the alien being standing in front of you. They're placing a family member in front of you, or like you mentioned, a deer or an owl. And there's people that are deathly afraid of owls, and I have other people that were afraid of shark eyes. They just look. They said they can't even look at them, not even in a movie. And of course they have no idea why they have this fear of, like, say, an owl. Why am I fearing this bird? I have no idea until I start putting everything together, until we start exploring. They have these memories back, since way back in childhood. And it's not until we start exploring and going through the regressions, but they do have conscious memory. No one ever comes to me with a completely blank mind and tells me, I want to know if I was abducted. Well, I can't work with someone like that, because then I feel like, okay, is this person a wannabe? Or, I explore their background. I send out a questionnaire, explore their background, ask them about their families, the mother, the father. Have they talked about anything high strangeness, I call it, because it is a family affair. So, it's very complicated. And it frustrates me when I hear these skeptics and debunkers, just spouting out their own theories. And these people are, they're all dreaming. They're all wannabes. I heard somebody not too long ago, a psychologist, say these people can't hold down jobs, and that struck me. I actually got angry, because that is totally untrue. I have professional people. I mean, like I said, people from all walks of life, but people like doctors and lawyers and firemen, and commercial airline pilots. You can't tell me they can't hold down a job.
You know, I think one of the interesting things is about triggers, the kinds of things that, as you mentioned, and you mentioned in the book, things that sort of trigger a memory. Suddenly, somebody knows something is wrong. They're afraid of something irrationally, like a metal instrument or something.
Yes.
And they see a movie or something else triggers. For a lot of people, I noticed it popped up a couple of times in your book, and I've read this before. It was the image on communion on the cover of Whitley Strieber's book. And when people saw that, wow! Well, for a lot of them, it was the trigger that made them remember something was going on.
And that still happens. I've told Whitley about it. That cover, I told him, has opened up so many doors for people. I mean, people actually will look at it and want to run away from it, and they didn't know why. We're going to have Melinda later on in the show. She reacted the same way when she saw the cover. But I get people still saying, "Oh my God!" When I saw the cover on Communion, it was like a couple of them had said, "Well, they kind of look like that," and then all of a sudden they realize, "Why did I say that? How do I know that? You know, where do I get this information?" But there are little triggers that people will get that have caused them to have the PTSD. And PTSD, as you know, anybody who has suffered a trauma, and we compare it with our military coming back from war.
Or rape.
But I've also dealt with people who've had terrible car accidents where they can't get back in their car, or they can't drive on a certain stretch of road or in that intersection where they were hit. And I work with them, with the PTSD, and I've told my audiences, all the symptoms are the same, whether it's a terrible car accident or military coming back, and I've worked with some military, or alien abduction. These symptoms are all the same. These people have suffered a trauma, and the subconscious job is to protect us from the trauma by blocking some of that memory.
Yvonne, let's talk about Coronado and the events on that weekend. Starting with a couple of the people you work with, your members, Alice and Lacey. They were roommates that weekend, right?
Yes, and they were in, and there's pictures in the book. They were in the one very old hotel called the Village Inn. They were roommates, and then down the hallway was Mike and his wife, and then on the opposite side, the other side of the hallway was Jack and his wife. So there were 6 people in that hotel who all experienced something same night.
And did they have conscious memories of it? Alice is the one that was kind of just woke up in the morning and was kind of discombobulated, right?
Oh, yeah. She woke up on the floor. She had her blanket, like a little spare blanket, wrapped around her neck. Mike woke up with blood on his pillow, and I show that in the book. And let me see. Jack woke up, or he had memory of a bright light coming in, and then they all heard someone screaming in the hallway.
Alice and Lacey are rooming together. Neither one of them, when they wake up in the morning, though, remember being taken, right? They just know something is kind of off.
They know that something, right, yes, that something... Yes, there's a hint of this with people, that especially with Alice, winding up on the floor. I believe it's between her bed and the closet, with a blanket wrapped around her. But she also felt, which is very, very typical of these experiences, very ill, flu-like symptoms. They feel very sore. The expression often is, "Oh, I feel like I've been run over by a truck." I hear that all the time.
I can't remember if there's these two ladies or they were part of the group, but a couple of the witnesses in the book describe encounters with what might be Secret Service agents or waiters. It's almost like a Men in Black kind of an encounter. Hey, it was really weird when we were at dinner and those 3 or 4 waiters are standing right there at the table in their dark suits.
Well, I was at that dinner, and that's what I had the advantage of being there, so I know what it was like. We were sitting in that beautiful dining room at the Del Coronado. It was after I regressed Lacey. I regressed her in my hotel room there at the Del Coronado, but not, it was on another experience, a missing time experience that she had. And the 3 of us, Alice and Lacey and I, went down to the dining room, and Lacey, she needed a glass of wine, much needed glass of wine after that regression. And I remember that there were about 3 or 4 waiters all standing around us, and almost as if, I think it was Alice saying, I feel like they're trying to hear our conversation. And it was a little strange because, we looked around, Alice looked around, Lacey looked around. Lacey was getting a little nervous about it because she thought, she was getting a bad feeling about it. And there was no one else at these other tables. And it wasn't totally crowded, but it wasn't empty either. No one else had 3 or 4 waiters around their table. So that was a little strange. I did not have my UFO MC badge on at this time. This was on the Friday night before the conference started. The conference was going to start early Saturday morning.
So could they have been Secret Service wondering, hey, should we keep an eye on these wacky UFO people?
Well, that's what I suspected. I figured, well, sure, we're going to be wacky to them, and and what better way is to dress like a waiter and hover around the table.
Contrary to what you may have seen on the website earlier tonight, we are not addressing the Bell Witch in this program, though I'm sure Seth would be happy to answer questions about the Bell Witch. That's an earlier film of his, came out last year. The new movie looks at the epicenter of weirdness, the Appalachia, possibly the oldest mountain range of the world, home to some of the strangest, oldest, oddest mysteries, a cornucopia of creatures, dark entities, spooky legends, mixed in with a heavy smattering of UFO incidents. Are all these different manifestations somehow related? And if so, how? Seth and his team collected eyewitness accounts and expert testimony from the people who populate the hills and hollows of West Virginia, which is where some of the strangest entities were first reported, including Mothman, the Men in Black, the Flatwoods Monster, and others, all while the same area has been among the hottest of UFO hotspots. Filmmaker Seth Breedlove and his company, Small Town Monsters, have explored the backwoods of coal country for 6 film projects, including the latest, On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky, which looks at possible intersections of things seen in the sky and beings seen on the ground. Seth, welcome back to Coast.
Hey, George. Thanks so much for having me.
I think what I appreciate about your films is that you have such a broad focus in your approach. I suspect you have a target, what the film is going to be about when you go into an area, but then you end up collecting so much more along the way. Sometimes I think you incorporate them into the films of the moment, and then sometimes you seem to stash them for the future. True?
Definitely, yeah. And I don't know, you might understand this, actually, being a journalist, but I did newspaper reporting before I did filmmaking, and I find that the way in which I direct a movie, a documentary, or edit a documentary is similar to how I did my stories, where the film itself is sort of directed by the flow of what the people we're interviewing are telling me. And so they're kind of guiding the actual story that we end up telling. And with a film like this, that's really important because we're able to pick at different threads and follow them and let the story basically tell itself. And with with something as sprawling as this, that's really important because we had 16 different people, telling their individual eyewitness stories and sort of guiding the flow of the film in that way.
Yeah, I do the same thing in news stories. I always gather more information than I can ever possibly use for an individual piece, but you stash it away for future projects, and those sound bites, the interviews, are always the building blocks of what goes on the air, and you make great use of the interviews. They're the characters that you speak to, their sincerity comes across, real people. It's great storytelling technique.
It is a weird thing. The film, in some ways, is a response to the current state of ufological entertainment, or whatever you want to call it, ufological journalism, whatever you want to call it. I've just noticed in the last couple of years that there's a shift in focus away from the regular people, the witnesses, the experiencers, whatever you want to call it, and in some cases it's needed and it's good. Obviously when you're looking at the military angle and all that kind of stuff, that stuff's very important. But at the end of the day, it's normal people that are experiencing these things, and people that just live out in the country somewhere in rural communities tend to be, the bulk of witnesses, and that the film really very purposefully focused on those people and their experiences, and that's something that I've always been drawn to when it comes to ufology and really any paranormal topic. It's just the witnesses and what they're encountering.
I joked the last time we spoke that if Joe Manchin ever leaves the U.S. Senate, you might be able to run for office in West Virginia. You've been all over that state, right?
Yeah. I mean, just since we talked, we were filming there again, so it's an unending trip back to the Mountain State for me. I feel like I'm there almost every weekend. Eventually, we need to set up like a satellite Small Town Monsters headquarters in the Mountain State somewhere. But I mean, the thing is that they've got a long history of this kind of weirdness, and when it comes to UFOs, I think maybe that gets overlooked. For some of the Southwest desert states, or like maybe even New England or something like that, people kind of forget about West Virginia and its ties to UFOs and the paranormal in general. But I mean, they've been in the thick of things going back to like 1952 when the Flatwoods monster case happened and that kind of stuff. So to me, it's a no-brainer to make this movie, and we had wanted to make this movie since we made our first Mothman movie, because that story, the Mothman story, is so tied into UFOs and UFO lore and things like the Men in Black and Intrigue Cold. And we had covered some of those things in some small amount of detail, but we weren't able to really dig into it in that movie. And so it's like you said, we had been stockpiling these stories that we wanted to tell in the history of UFOs in that state. We've been keeping that in our back pocket, knowing that eventually we would get to that story. And it just happened to be this movie on the trail of UFOs Dark Sky.
Let's talk about why West Virginia, why Appalachia, why such a concentration of so much weirdness. I mean, you could see the critics or skeptics saying that people there must have vivid imaginations, or they might joke, well, these are all country bumpkins. Why don't UFOs appear over major cities, which of course they do. I can hear the knives being sharpened now to go after your witnesses.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and it came up almost immediately in the earliest reviews for the movie. That there's too much moon sign in the backwoods of West Virginia and those kind of jokes. But I find that the people we interviewed, and just in general, the people I talk to when I go to West Virginia tend to be normal folk, very kind people, and not exactly the stereotype of what pop culture kind of tells us that West Virginia is. Now, why that state in particular, that's one of the big questions we're asking throughout the movie. And, like with any of the projects I make, we're putting the information out there and letting the audience make up their own minds as to what they think is going on. So throughout the film, one of the most frequently recited reasons why there might be so many UFOs seen in the skies over West Virginia is that it's a dark sky state. I mean, and what that means is that there are more places in that state where you can actually see, like the Milky Way, where you can get a really good, almost zero light pollution look at the sky. There's numerous places like that in that state because there aren't a lot of big cities. The biggest city in the state is Charleston, and it's not a massive city by any stretch of the imagination. it's a place where there are not a lot of people. You get back into the hills, and there just aren't people living there. So there's almost zero light pollution. But there's darker reasons why that might be the case as well. There's theories that there are numerous hidden government installations around the state of West Virginia, and that's not entirely, conspiracy theory. We know that Greenbrier, the massive resort, had a bunker that was hidden under it where the president and his cabinet could retreat to in the case of like a nuclear attack or something like that. We know that existed there. There's rumors that all throughout the mountains that there's these hidden underground bases around the state of West Virginia. That actually holds true for most of Appalachia. You go down to North Carolina, and around Brown Mountain, there's rumors that are similar to that there's a secret government installation in the mountains down there. There's all sorts of strange encounters that have happened between ordinary people and shadowy military personnel in the woods. You can throw a rock in that state and you'll find someone who has a story about seeing a battalion of unmarked military vehicles go by, and I've even talked to people from that state that claim that they encountered Russian military training in the mountains there. So there's all sorts of like weird, shadowy military stories. Beyond that, you have these numerous sightings that correlate to energy sources. There's a place in West Virginia known as the Chemical Valley. It's it's like a stretch of land. It's actually not that far from like Point Pleasant. It's a very industrialized section of the state. And in that area, there were numerous sightings from the 70s all the way through the 80s, and I guess up to present day as well, of these UFOs seen near these various power plants. And one of the interesting theories that comes up in the movie is that, you might not be able to necessarily say these are nuclear power plants, but if you combined the various components being created at each of the plants, you could potentially create, some sort of nuclear energy, which is super fascinating. But beyond that, there's also the fact that so many of the sightings are taking place near coal mines or mines of some sort that are dotting that state. And that's not even getting into some of the more outlandish, reasons why UFOs might be seen. But the one thing to say is that this isn't a new phenomenon. UFOs in West Virginia goes back as far as UFOs have been seen in the United States and reported on. But especially starting in 1952 with Flatwoods monster case up to present day, the sightings don't even, I would hesitate to say that they wax and wane. I think it's a pretty steady stream of reports that come in regarding UFOs. It's just, to me, it seems like it's very overlooked by the UFO community. It's sort of underreported on.
Tell me about that. So is there a central mechanism for collecting those reports in West Virginia, or is it difficult to get rural people to open up and share that information with anyone?
I think it's difficult for organizations to get their hands on reports from that state. So MUFON is obviously based in West Virginia. They have not based in, but they have a branch in West Virginia. But I would reckon that folks like Les Odell, who lives there and is featured in our movie, he runs a local West Virginia-based paranormal research group. I think people like him or Ron Lanham and Joe Perdue, who run Wild and Weird West Virginia, because they're based in that state, I think locals are probably more willing to talk to those guys because they're talking to people that live there, that understand them, that aren't going to, maybe denigrate what they're saying or detract and try to make them, I guess that at the end of the day, people don't necessarily want to report something to someone and immediately have that person try to debunk it. And while I understand the importance of that, and I'm all for the importance of debunking and trying to get to the bottom of what's going on, in a state like West Virginia, those people are going to balk at that almost immediately because they're not expecting to be taken seriously to begin with. So so talking to someone like Les or Ron and Joe, or any of the local investigators in the 80s, it was a guy named Bob Teets, and Bob wrote a book, I think, called Mountain State, UFOs in the Mountain State, or something to that effect. That book is the book that we really drew off of in terms of case files to find, because he was based there, he spoke to people there. In terms of like UFO knowledge about West Virginia, Bob seems to have been the guy. And it's sad because you don't hear this guy's name anymore. I had never heard his name before he found this book, but Bob really did a great job of compiling, UFO stories. I mean, obviously, you also have guys like Gray Barker and John Keel did a lot of work in the state of West Virginia. So what it comes down to is I just don't think that the people that live in that state necessarily want to report things to like a national UFO, reporting branch or anything like that, MUFON. I'm sure they do, but I think more than likely the really solid stuff is coming to the locals.
Yeah, I can understand that. There's a presumption. I lived in the South for a couple of years, so I do not assume, as some people do, that anyone with a drawl or an accent is some kind of a bumpkin. That is
Right.
simply an unfair stereotype and inaccurate. But I'm sure that they've had that experience when they share a story about something they've seen. They get ridiculed on the basis of that stereotype.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and even when I go there to make a movie, we rely on some of those friends of ours that are based in that state to set the stage for us, to introduce us, to get us in the door, because we come in there with our Ohio non-accents, and
Well, aren't you fancy?
Yeah. We're just talking to the locals, and they don't know what to expect of us either. But if you can either have someone who's based there to introduce you, or you can show them our track record of the movies we've made, and maybe that'll help you out as well. But people are standoffish, but they're not rude about it. We've been to places where people are rude about it. They just in the state of West Virginia, they're a little hesitant to really open up about what's happened to them until you can get your foot in the door.
Among the rich stories from Appalachia, the Flatwoods monster case from 1952. Seth, bring us up to date on that for those not familiar with that case, why it's a classic.
Yeah, gladly. And this was one of those stories that we knew there were other angles to, but we didn't have the opportunity to cover them in our initial, movie. We actually made a movie in 2018 about the Flatwoods monster. And weirdly enough, every time I'm located in a town called Wadsworth, Ohio. I've had multiple people in this area come up to me at events and tell me that they had some connection to that case. So it's a case that there's a lot more to it than what's been put out over the years, and what's been put out over the years isn't necessarily accurate either. So, 1952, September 12th, 1952, there was a string of UFO sightings across the United States, particularly the eastern seaboard, heading all the way down to Alabama. One of these mysterious objects that were seen in the skies was seen flying over the town, or I guess you'd call it a village, of Flatwoods, West Virginia, which is smack dab in the middle of the state of West Virginia. It is almost exactly the geographic center of the state. These kids are playing football on a field. Eddie May, Freddie May, Tommy Heyer, and one other whose name escapes me. But they see this object go overhead and comes to kind of a controlled stop or controlled landing on top of a hill. They rush up the road to the top of the hill, and along the way they stop at Ed and Fred May's house and get Mrs. May, Kathleen May, and another boy, Gene Lemon, who was actually a National Guardsman at the time. They also get their dog. They head up to the top of the hill, and some of this is just simply the version of the story that exists. I don't necessarily believe that what took place has been recounted properly over the years, and might not have been until our movie came out. But they go up the hill, and according to legend, they encounter a glowing object on top of the hill a downed UFO. They supposedly approached the UFO. There was a string of mist in the air. According to legend, they all became really sick. There was vomiting and retching and all that kind of stuff. The dog took off running down the hill, and according to legend, again, the dog died. Now, the reality is that dog never died, and also that there was probably no UFO immediately seen. They definitely saw something down in the forest, but probably not a UFO up close. But they had a little further up the hill, and near a forest, right next to this tree, emerges this 13-foot tall object, and it's kind of become known as a creature over the years. But it's just this strange, massive creature with what looks like an ace of spades for a head. Its shape's kind of like a rocket. Ed May would later say was shaped like a B-12 or B-2 rocket, something like that. The creature seemed to hover in the air and come toward them, and they all took off running back down the hill and called the police. The police phoned it into the National Guard, and before you know it, the National Guard comes out to investigate the scene. And, for a lot of people, that's where the story ends, but the fact is that there were other sightings of creatures similar to the Flatwoods Monster. There was a sighting that took place maybe just a few days prior near the town of Heaters by a young girl, two young girls, actually, who claimed to have encountered the same creature. And then there was a sighting the very next day by a man named George Smitowski, who was driving on a back road late at night and suffered some sort of strange engine failure. And while he was checking the engine, he heard a weird noise, turned around, and saw basically the same thing, the Flatwoods Monster coming right toward him. Now, also around the same time, were sightings in Wheeling, West Virginia, of what the local media dubbed Bashful Billy, which is one of the more West Virginia names you're going to hear given to a monster. But it's the same sort of description, 13-foot tall. The media said it breathed fire and was this Frankenstein-looking creature, which is also what they said about the Flatwoods Monster itself, the Green Monster. And all these sightings are within just a few days of each other, all within, maybe 2-3 hours of each other, and all accompanying this massive UFO wave that sweeps down the eastern seaboard. One other thing that's interesting about this is, today Flatwoods is sort of known as, this is what they're known for. This is what Flatwoods and the town of Sutton, West Virginia are known for. And they've capitalized on it through a small Flatwoods Monster Museum and an event that they do on September 12th called Braxy Bazaar, which I'll actually be at. So it's kind of a cool. They've used it, to I guess assist the tourism in the town. It's a really cool town too.
Other than eyewitness accounts, is there anything else to substantiate it? Did the National Guard find tracks or physical evidence of some sort where this thing supposedly crashed or where the creature was seen hovering?
So they found tracks. Later, the tracks were debunked as being one of the tractors that had actually driven up the hill to try to find the Flatwoods Monster. They've definitely corroborated that this was an event that happened, that they went and investigated. But what was seen and what was there, according to them, there was really no material left behind following their investigation. Now, if this could be a Kecksburg incident, maybe they ran off with it and put it in Wright-Patterson, like Kecksburg or Roswell, who knows? But according to the National Guardsmen that were there was nothing left at the scene. There was an oil slick, again blamed on a tractor or a truck that had driven up the hill to actually try to find the Flatwoods Monster. But, there was a detailed examination of the scene, certainly by the National Guard. So they took it seriously enough that they sent a pretty decent regiment of men up to the top of this hill in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, to look into it. So that itself kind of tells you something about the case.
Something that large with a head shaped like an ace of spades and it's hovering, coming toward the witnesses. and then it gets a nickname Bashful Billy. It seems like something that would be easy to debunk or diminish, at least, because it sounds so preposterous. But that's what the witnesses saw.
Yeah, that's what they claim to have seen. And Bashful Billy, the Bashful Billy case is super interesting because it takes place in a lower-income housing area part of Wheeling. And there was apparently at the time just an unwillingness by the police to even go there. So when that report was called in, when people called in the reports of seeing this creature, this 13-foot tall, metallic creature wandering around, the police didn't even want to go investigate. What's interesting about that, though, is that supposedly there was a police officer who was attacked by this thing and burned. That was in one of the initial reports that was in the newspaper. However, we can't really find any evidence that actually took place, that a police officer was burned. It's just part of that initial newspaper story. And unfortunately, at that point in time, it's just hard to tell what's fact and what's fiction.
So this happens. Flatwood Monster is seen, multiple witnesses, different locations, September 1952, during a big UFO wave. So is that creature from the UFO? Is that what we think?
I mean, that's part of the theory, obviously, that people work with. The fact is that Ed May and Fred May, they were two of the witnesses, and they're the ones we have to go off of what they're saying because they're the only remaining living witnesses that we can talk to. What they claim they encountered wasn't a creature as detailed by the newspaper reports or even Gray Barker and Ivan Sanderson, who were two of the first people to investigate the case. They claim what they saw was basically some sort of experimental rocket that hovered slightly off the ground that had two portholes, not eyes, two portholes that had light spilling out of them. Their impression was that there was something or somebody inside that rocket that was actually controlling it. And if you talk to either of them, their opinion on whether or not this was alien can change on any given day. I know Ed May believes that what he encountered was an experimental prototype rocket that was probably put there by the U.S. military. But the fact that there was this string of UFO sightings across the seaboard is definitely going to raise red flags. And there was actually a second object that crashed that night. The one in Flatwoods wasn't the only one that was said to crash. There was a report that came in to the local sheriff of a airplane going down over the Elk River right outside of Sutton. And in fact, when Kathleen May went and called the police after encountering the Flatwoods monster, the police were not in the office at the time because they were investigating this supposed down aircraft. There was no aircraft ever found, but there were reports all over the area of people seeing something streak across the sky and crash into the top of the hill near the Elk River. And that's just a second crash, that coincides with the Flatwoods event.
You start your film On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky. It starts with a pretty good UFO case that most of the world never heard of. I had never heard of it before. This big red diamond that was hovering around power lines, which, again, sort of fits in with your theme about how often they are seen in connection with power facilities. Talk about that. Tell us about that story, what you learned.
Yeah, this is such a great story, and again, I think this is one of the ones that we pulled from Bob Teet's book. Again, I can't stress enough that is a very important document that really catalogs a lot of West Virginia's weird history, and it's one that I think is overlooked. But the witness's name was Kenneth Shannon. And Kenneth was great. Shannon did just an amazing job of talking to him and really getting the details of the case. But basically in the 1980s, during dinner one night, he's there, his whole family's there, he's got cousins and uncles there. One of them sees this bizarre object appear in the sky over a power line. They rush outside to see it. Multiple members of the family see this object. It's shaped like you said, like a diamond. If you're aware of the Cash Landrum encounter that took place in Texas, it sounds like an object that might have been somewhat similar to that. It's got he describes there being a pulsing red center to this thing. It hovers over the power lines. It seems to be leaching some sort of energy off the power lines. And then it goes away. And then what happens is over the remainder of this week, the object returns multiple times, always around the same time. It's in the evening. It makes its appearance. It's not trying to stay hidden. Kenneth's mother saw it 5 times. He sees it 3 times. On one of the occasions, when it appears over the power lines, a neighbor actually comes out and fires a shot at this thing, connects with it, and these sparks, or as he described them, almost like tiny orbs, fly off of this craft and take off into the woods. And what's interesting is they still see these orbs in the woods today. People around the area still report seeing these strange glowing balls of light moving through the woods at night, which is just a really weird detail. But they see this thing multiple times over the course of the week, always in the same spot, always doing the same thing, seemingly leaching power or some sort of energy off the power lines. And then it all kind of culminates late in the week. Kenneth's up in the woods behind his house, and he encounters a hazmated, what he says is a hazmat-suited individual that he's not sure if it was a human being or not because it's in this uniform that he describes as a hazmat. And he actually had a BB gun on him at the time, so as he would do as a kid, he points the BB gun at this thing and fires some shots at it. It seems to remain completely unfazed, and the thing leaves, and after 1 week, the sightings stop. And, obviously tying into the energy sources and the power lines, but also interestingly enough is that, there's a mine, a massive coal mine right on the other side of that hill as well. So it kind of connects to some of the various threads that we're pulling at in the movie. But it's a really weird case, and it involves multiple corroborating witnesses. And, Kenneth was affected by this in a pretty major way. He actually moved away when he got older and kind of swore he'd never go back to that road again. And thankfully, we managed to get him there to conduct the interview. And it's a really, really interesting interview and had a pretty big effect on him, I think, as a person, and as it would, I guess, if you encountered something like that.
So this incident of people just grabbing a gun and taking a pot shot at things they don't know what it is, whether it's a UFO or a strange man in a hazmat suit, that pops up again and again, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and not just in West Virginia. I mean, you've got the Kelly Hopkinsville Goblin case from the town of Kelly, Kentucky. That's a pretty common theme throughout. I would assume much of the United States is that when people encounter something they don't know, you're going to react, one of maybe like 2 or 3 ways, and one of those is to get defensive or offensive and start shooting at the thing. I mean, it's interesting because we're preparing for this the cattle mutilation movie we're making, and one of the things I keep coming across are reports of ranchers firing shots at black helicopters or helicopters in general.
Yeah.
That are flying over their ranches. In a lot of cases, it was nothing. It was like a military helicopter or something. But because they were so on edge from the things they were experiencing, they would fire shots at those vehicles. So it is, it's a pretty common occurrence to get on the offensive.
Well, so far, none of these gunshots have sparked an interstellar war or an interdimensional invasion. But
not that we're aware of.
Yeah. I mentioned before about Shannon as being your secret weapon, Shannon LeGros, who lives here in Las Vegas. She's been our guest on this show, and I've interviewed her for Mystery Wire, and she does a great job of sort of breaking the ice with witnesses who may not otherwise want to speak to you.
Yeah, she's amazing, and she's once you get into the interview, she's the one that guides the witness and leads, what is going to actually come out, and has to take the reins and kind of make sure that witness feels at ease, which again is something you're probably very familiar with. But I mean, that's probably the biggest part of her job, is trying to make sure that people are at ease and are able to reconstruct the events in their mind and tell us the event in their own words. And Shannon has always been amazing at doing that. And Shannon herself refers to herself as a collector of stories. And the first time I heard that, I thought that was such a unique way of putting it, because she doesn't brand herself as a paranormal investigator or a UFO expert or ufologist or any of that. She just collects stories. And, trying to maybe start piecing together some of the connecting threads of those stories, the tissue of those stories, is something we've just started to do. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing is that she's able to collect those stories at all, because in a lot of these cases, these are not people who want to talk about these experiences. And Kenneth is like the perfect example of that. Like, Kenneth took us back to the location where he had seen this diamond-shaped craft, but he wasn't interested really in telling his story. A witness doesn't gain anything by doing that. Very often you hear they're chasing fame and fortune. There's no fame and fortune in a UFO, in a completely independent UFO documentary production, right?
No.
We're not paying this guy $1 million to be in the movie. So he has nothing to gain by being involved in it. And he was just willing to tell a story because Shannon was so good at getting it out of him.
Seth Breedlove, the new movie is called On the Trail of UFOs, Dark Sky. My guest, Mike Cleland, has written The Messengers and Stories from the Messengers about owls, synchronicity, how owls seem to be in the proximity with the alien abduction type experiences, missing time, other strange experiences as well. We're going to hear some of those stories. And then at the bottom of this hour, we open up the phone lines with your calls and questions and hopefully some of your own experiences with owls. So, Mike, you've collected hundreds of stories. Hit me with some of them. Hit me with some of the examples of kinds of things that, for example, you write in that people read the first book and they react. It triggers memories. What are the kinds of memories that it triggers? What are the experiences that you've heard?
So they'll remember owl stories in particular. Well, here's a simple one from this is a fellow who was almost in conjunction with reading my book, that or I guess he was. So I got a hold of this guy named Ben, and him and I have become close friends. And he's one of these maybe people. I'm very cautious to put him in a category, but let me tell you, if he tells you stories, they sound like the kind of stories a UFO experiencer would tell. He was with his kids, and they were at a roller skating party, and all the kids were coming home in the van, and he said, this was the night I was going to talk about. All the kids in the van said, Dad, tell a story. And so he said, I'm going to tell them about these UFO experiences. And he told a handful of these bizarre stories to these kids in this van, and they were all really into it. And at the end, the last story culminated with a missing time experience. And when he told the story, right when he finished the story, right at the moment of finishing the story, an owl flew past the windshield. And so it was like this instantaneous moment. Finish the story, owl flies past the windshield. Later, he takes the kids on a hike, his own kids, and they walk down this path. And they're in the woods, and they're walking down this path, and there's an owl that flies and follows them. It goes from one tree to the other, and it follows them along. And the kids love it. He's kind of freaked out. So that night, the kids are very young, and that night he says, okay, I'll pick a book, I'll come up and read to you. So they pick a book called Say Boo. It's about a ghost that cannot say the word boo. So the ghost can't scare anyone because it can't say boo. So it's getting close to Halloween, and the ghost is all upset because he can't scare anyone, so he goes to the cow, and instead of saying boo, he says moo. And so he eventually meets an owl, and he can't say boo, but he could say who. So as he's reading this, the ghost is named Ben, and my friend's name is Ben. He's reading the book, and he reads the line aloud. Then Ben looked up into a tall pine tree and saw an owl. And the dog downstairs starts barking. So he runs downstairs, and he opens the door. There's nothing out there. He looks up in the tree, and there's an owl in the tree. And he is convinced, or feels strongly, let's say, that was the same owl that had followed them down the path that day. So, I write this story up, and he was super helpful. So he's doing these kind of things. I really want it to be accurate, so I go back and forth with documents over email and say, okay, I want it to be correct, because it's your story, not mine. And he's correcting the text, and he goes, you know what? These are the same stories. This is two stories of mine, right? So the story where I'm in the car telling the story. I'm finding my voice. The first time I ever tell that story is to my kids. I'm finding my voice. And the second story is this children's book. And there's a powerful synchronicity about this children's book where this ghost is trying to find his voice, and then I see the owl out the back door. Now, this happened in conjunction with writing the present book, and I have found that a lot where I'm not quite answering your question directly. I'm sort of in a way indirectly answering the same question. Where the act of working on these stories with the people, they will often go from maybe people to saying, I feel strongly that I have had some sort of UFO contact. So I'm convinced the act of writing has some sort of power to it. The creative process of writing, putting things in a book, talking aloud on a podcast. I have had so many people. There's one fellow in the new book who was driving in his car, coming home from work. He crossed a bridge. An owl flew right in front of his windshield and scared him. Full daylight. Whoa, it really shocked him. Big owl flies right in front of his windshield. He drives about a half a mile further, and there's a big UFO hovering alongside of the highway. He was in traffic. He had to just keep on moving, and he lost sight of it. Now, he was listening to my voice he had taken a lecture that I had given that's on YouTube and downloaded it and was listening to that lecture. So this blew my mind where he was listening to my story about owls and UFOs as he saw an owl and a UFO. And I have no idea what to make of that. The power of that synchronicity is just the knot is just tied so tight I can't untangle it.
You have several, at least a few instances where people describe owls that are impossibly large, right? And they're not really thinking anything of it. There's a 4-foot-tall owl.
That is very common. Yes, that's very common. Yeah, and usually in the context is alongside the road. I have an amazing. So the typical story is, someone's driving down the road, and I have a story of this where a fellow told me this story. It was funny. He told it at a UFO experiencer support group, and he was at the group, and everyone in the group, and Leo Sprinkle was leading this. That was a man I have a huge respect for. Was leading this group at the conference when they used to be held in Laughlin, Nevada, and he's off in the corner, didn't say anything. Right at the end of the meeting, he kind of raises his hand and says, "Has anyone in the room here had any odd experiences with owls?" And I mean, he almost fell out of his chair when everyone in the room raised their hand, including me. And then he told this story where he said, I was driving down the road at night, and there was a 4-foot-tall owl on the side of the road. And I pulled right up next to it, and I rolled my window down, and I looked at it. And I got this really bad feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be there. So I got in the car, I just hit the gas and drove away. He's a photographer, and he went and took pictures of some owls in a nest in the woods. Someone had told him about this nest in the woods, and he takes these pictures of owls. And as he's taking the pictures, he's like, I don't think that was an owl I saw that night. So he actually goes and gets hypnotic regression. Very little comes up out of his hypnosis session, except the owl was wearing boots. So here we have again this blurring, like something. It's because there's no owl on Earth that is 4 foot tall. There's big owl is a 2-foot-tall owl is a huge owl. So a 4-foot-tall owl is simply impossible, can't exist. And I actually had to I could have filled 3 volumes of books just in stories of 4-foot-tall owls. It would have got a little repetitive at a certain point. So there's only so much you can say when you hear the same story over and over again.
This guy went as far as to have hypnotic regression. Have you considered it for yourself?
I have attempted it 4 times. And then I had some interesting stuff show up, though very little that it feels like it confirmed anything for me. So I had a hypnosis session with Bud Hopkins when he was still alive, and just recently I had a hypnosis session with Mary Rodwell.
In the new book,
go on.
You have several examples where it is transformative. The experience really does change people in dramatic ways. They're different after the encounter. The owls are part of the encounter. There's other stuff that's going on, obviously, but a lot of things happen to them. Some they can remember, some they can't, but they are different people afterward. Susan McLeod is one of the examples in the new book. What happened to her?
Oh my gosh, that's a great story. It's funny because she told an amazing story, and at the end of the story, like, I got a hold of her and said, and she has owl totem poles all around her house. She has Native American heritage or First Nation heritage. She lives in Canada, and so she has seen a lot of owls. At the time of this event, there were owls all around her house, and she has had other experiences. So she had an amazing experience where she had a friend that died, and she has a teepee in her place in Ontario, off in the woods. So she walks down the path from her house to the teepee, and it's at nighttime, and she builds a fire and burns sage and pounds the drum, and she's having a ceremony, a ritual ceremony, which I think is important, like what was going on leading up to this experience. She was performing a ceremony. And she's in this teepee, and she feels something brush against the teepee, and it's big. And she's like, oh my gosh, is there a bear out there? So she opens the teepee window, or the steps out, and there's a family, or she says it's a family, she calls it a family of 5 Sasquatch, standing, boom, right there, outside the teepee. She runs back in, she beats the drum some more, she really beats it loud, she's kind of freaked out, and then she peeks out again, and they seem to be gone. So she runs really quickly back up to the house, and she sees them down further away. And she gets the distinct feeling that they moved, this family of 5. She said they were standing like a corny family portrait with the 2 adults in the back and 3 small ones in the front. Big, hairy Sasquatch. Now, she runs into the house to tell her kids, and the kids are all freaked out. Mom, there's something in the house. And there's black shadow beings that are zipping around the house. And she burns some sage, and she comes from a tradition of healers, and then she wants to tell her husband, who's in the garage, it's his wood shop, and so she goes to run, and she knocks on the door, and the door's locked. She can't get in. She's actually barricaded the door so no one can get in. And she gets in, and she says, "What's going on?" He says, "What's going on? What is?" And he's seeing the same black shadow figures. He's terrified. They're zipping in and out of the garage. They're peeking in the windows. She says, "Oh, I gotta step away and just figure out what's going on." So she steps aside, and she literally says, "I asked God, what does this mean?" And a triangle-shaped UFO hovers above her in the night sky. It just passes over above her, just barely above the trees. Her husband saw it too. Actually, it was her partner at the time. They weren't married. And she said something unusual. It was like flitting in and out of like reality. It wasn't like a solid structure. It was like kind of a hologram of a triangle craft. This at a time when she was seeing all kinds of owls, and she has amazing, beautiful owl stories that associate with death. That where she, I think there's these people who have kind of a magnetism for these kind of paranormal experiences, and she's certainly one of them. So